In this session, let's talk about exposure controls with Arnold. Now, first, before we can adjust our exposure, we first need to have lights in our scene. Okay, so this is our sample scene. Let's go to the Create tab, Lights, then go to Arnold, then Arnold Light. Okay, so in the front viewport, let's create a quad light. Hit render. Go to our camera view and render it. Okay, so there are four ways you can control the exposure or the brightness of your render. The first is by directly increasing the intensity of your light. So for example, let's move our light to the correct position first. Okay, so the first way is to increase directly the exposure value of your light. For example, here, increasing the exposure value by one increment doubles the intensity of the light. So for example, 9. Okay, so let's find the best setting. Then let's say 12 or 13. Okay, so by increasing the intensity of the light, you also increase the brightness of your render or your exposure. That is one way. Okay. The second way to control exposure is by increasing or decreasing the distance of your light from your subject. So for example, here, okay, by looking at our target distance, we are at 1,154 or approximately, let's do it this 1,200, for example. So we are approximately 1,200 millimeters from our subject. Okay, by moving the light twice the distance. Okay, so by increasing the distance twice. Okay, for example, let's move it backwards, move it back to twice the distance, that is 2,400. For example, you reduced the intensity of light by half or one stop. Okay, moving the light half of the distance or by decreasing the distance or halving the distance. Okay, so that's bring it back to 1,200. You increase the light by one stop or you double the brightness of your exposure. Okay, so that is the second way to brighten up your scene. Okay, the second step or the third way to increase the brightness or decrease or control the exposure of your scene is by adding more lights. Okay, so for example, if we add another Arnold light with the same settings, for example, Arnold light with the same settings, okay, and move it to the same location as our previous light. Okay, just like this. Remove the target. Okay. By adding a light, you also increase the exposure by one stop. Okay. So by adding another light, for example, let's clone this light instance, adding more light, adding another, or doubling the light, for example, increases the light again by one stop. And doubling the light again increases the illumination again to 1 stop. Okay? So that is the third way of increasing the brightness of your scene. The last the last way, or the fourth way to control the exposure of your scene, is by using 3D Max exposure controls. Okay, so to do that, press 8. Okay, under the environment and effects settings. Okay, so the exposure control can be controlled globally using the environment and effects window, or you can control it individually by camera by adjusting the exposure controls in your camera settings. Okay, so first, let's close this window first. Okay, so let's close this window. Right. Now, so let's render it again. Right. So to control the exposure, we first need to install the physical camera exposure control. Okay. So the default value here is the physical camera exposure control. Check. This is check. If you want to control the exposure control per camera, if you want to control the camera globally, you have to either increase the exposure value or exposure compensation, just like your DSLR exposure controls. So if you want to increase the current exposure by 1 stop, you add 1 stop increase here. Okay. Increase the value. There. 0, 1 stop increase, 2 stop increase, 3 stop increase, 4 stop increase. Or -1 increase to make it darker, -2, -3. Okay, so this is like your exposure control, exposure compensation control in your DSLR cameras. Okay, now if you want to control, if you want to use the exposure control globally, okay, you can uncheck this one and you can set the exposure value globally using the global exposure settings. So at default, it is at 6 exposure value or 6 EV. Increasing this increases the brightness of your scene, or decreases the brightness of your scene. Okay. Okay. For example, so let's bring it back to 6. Increasing the value decreases the brightness of your scene. So let's say 10. Okay. For if you want to make the scene brighter, decrease the value of your exposure value. So let's bring it down to 4. And there you have it. Okay. So this is controlling the exposure using the environment and effects rollup. Another way is by controlling the exposure in camera. But first, you have to check this one. Use physical camera controls if available. And then, let's close this. Let's go select our camera. Okay, let's just wait for it to refresh. Okay, there you go. So we have now our camera. Let's select our physical camera. And then under okay, we first need to disable exposure control in our environment and effects dialog box. So press 8 again and then select no exposure control. Okay. From here, you can now control the exposure control per camera. So select your camera and under exposure rollout in the modify tab, install exposure control. Okay. So again, the default value is 6 EV. Increasing this value will make the scene darker, just like in the global settings. 12, 15, 16. Okay, so let's bring it down to 6 again. The default value. If you want to make it brighter, you can decrease the value here. 4. Okay, so that's one way. Or if you want manual control, just like a physical camera, go to manual and then specify the ISO. Let's say the ISO is ISO 100. Okay, and then under the shutter speed type, you can specify 1/seconds. So let's say 1/15 seconds. And then the aperture, let's say 2.8. And there you go. Okay, so if you want to manually control the exposure, just like a camera, you can use the manual settings. Now, for me, to make it simple, I only use the exposure value here in automatic mode. So if I want to make it brighter, I just increase or decrease the exposure value in this setting. Okay. Now the manual control, okay, can also help in the different camera effects. So for example, if you want to simulate depth of field, you adjust the aperture. Okay. And if you want to simulate motion blur, you adjust your shutter speed. Okay. So with this manual settings, if you open up your aperture, okay, for example, like this, you have a brighter scene and you also affect the depth of field. So for example, let's do that. Okay, let's move the camera closer. Let's close this first. Let's move the camera closer. Okay. And then let's turn off perspective control. Excuse me. Okay. 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 So let's move the camera closer. And then set under bokeh and depth of field. Let's enable depth of field in the aperture. There you go. And then let's render. Okay. So for that to be more visible, yes, look here. It's more focused here compared to this one. Okay. You can increase the effect by increasing your focal length. Let's say 85 mm and moving it back. Let's focus on the the the, the let's focus here on the top of the teapot, increasing our focus distance. So as you can see, this one is focused and the rest of the image is blurred. So by decreasing again the aperture or opening up your aperture, let's say 1.4, okay? If you're set to manual, it will also brighten up the scene. But if it's set to automatic, you're just controlling the aperture or the depth of field. Okay, so that is the difference between the manual and the automatic exposure or the target exposure value controls. Okay, so if let's say we double the shutter speed to 30, scene gets darker. We double it again to 60. That's one stop. We make the scene darker. And 125. That's one stop. 250. That's one stop. 500. Okay, so those are the full stop increments of your shutter speeds. Full stop increments of the aperture is 1.4. Then 2. That's one stop. 2.8. Okay. Then 4. 5.6. Normally, if you want to increase, if you're increasing the apertures, okay, you have to decrease also your shutter speed or increase your ISO. Okay, so those are the different ways to control exposure in our node.